In 2012, the Maine Aquaculture Innovation Center supported a Sea Grant-led project that brought together new kelp farming technology and existing shellfish farms in Maine to start developing integrated seaweed and shellfish aquaculture. Seeded line was provided by Ocean Approved's Kelp Nursery in Portland, and lines were placed underneath, between, and outside of mussel rafts along the coast of Maine. Year 2 of the project grew sugar kelp lines on 3 different farms and was the first year that trialed experimental lines of dulse and native porphyra. 2013-2014 was the 3rd year of this project, which included 5 farms. Ocean Approved put the earliest lines out with the first planting of both alaria and sugar kelp taking place in late August and early September in Casco Bay. The other farm in Casco Bay planted sugar kelp in December. Lines were strung between 2 mussel rafts and placed about 7 feet down. By March and April, the young tender vegetables were ready to harvest. By June, the season had ended and the fouling had begun. These plants were harvested and dried. By July, all of the lines were out of the water. The Walpole farm also had an early planting of sugar kelp, alaria, and dulse, with lines in by early and late September.
But you can see that, especially along the
In October, we were seeing a lot of growth of the seeded dulse and sugar kelp. But the alaria longline and lines under the raft were becoming fouled and showing little to no indication of growth. By December, the September planted sugar kelp was impressive. We did another late seeding of sugar kelp in December. There was some promising growth on the dulse lines, but for the most part, the plants had been smothered by overgrowth on the lines. There was still no sign of the alaria we had planted, and by now we had pretty much given up on these. But just 1 month later, in January, we found a few small alaria plants. This line then continued to surprise us in February when the plants appeared, took off, and started growing like weeds. The dulse plants that had made it through the overlay of fouling from earlier in the season had a nice color, but were still pretty small. And the kelp lines that we planted later in the season were starting to be visible on the lines, but weren't growing quite as quickly as we would have liked. By April, the sugar kelp lines that were planted later in the season were starting to take off, though some light fouling was starting to appear at the tips of the blades. The September planted kelp line was impressive, coming up to the surface like monsters of the deep. These too were starting to foul at the ends, and some had already developed reproductive sorus tissue. The dulse plants under the raft had gone reproductive, which led to a loss of color and a decrease in overall quality. These lines were terribly fouled and irredeemable. The alaria was growing and growing, and from an empty line had sprung a harvest of the first cultivated wing kelp for the farm. It was around the same time in April that Ocean Approved discovered the line of their surprise alaria as well.
This, right in this short section, it came up very quickly. It grew very quickly. And then more slowly along the rest of the line, plants started to appear.
By May, the sugar kelp plants were ready to harvest.
Yeah, they're fairly, these are going to start fouling.
And the growers worked hard all season to dry and pack the farmed kelp. Much of it was used to make the first ever kelp beer at Marshall Wharf Brewing in Belfast, Maine, a Scottish ale called Sea Belt. The Sorrento Farm is a large deep-water lease located outside of Sorrento Harbor in Frenchman's Bay. Experimental long lines were installed mid-winter and sugar kelp and alaria lines were planted in December. Young blades of sugar kelp were already apparent in January, as well as little alaria blades complete with a tiny midrib. Lines were showing growth through February and were a couple of feet by April.
Now this is a sugar kelp without a midrib. It's just got those ripples on the edge. You see how it's got kind of ruffles on the edge?
Yep.
The alaria lines were already ready to harvest by April, showing again their amazing growth rates. They were fouled by a hydrozoan settlement in May and June and had to come to the end of their season, highlighting the importance of timing of harvest during this late spring period. The sugar kelp was heavy and thick on the line, but it too fouled in June and did not reach very great lengths. Timing is of the utmost importance in sea farming. Planting and harvest season must be appropriately timed to optimize growth rates and avoid biofouling. Year 1 produced small blades because of the late planting date. Year 2 produced larger, more harvestable blades with an earlier planting date, and Year 3 produced the largest crop of all with a September planting. There were problems with fouling all 3 years during late spring and early summer. Ideally, sugar kelp plants should be in the water by September and out by May. There are differences in growth season and growth rates in the sugar kelp and alaria, and we expect to learn much more in the seasons to come.